by talking about Axios, environment variables, and cores. Later, we will create our database in SQL Server using Entity Framework Core. Then, we will do the CRUD logic for each of our entities. That is, we will be able to create, read, update, and delete records from each of the tables in our database. We are going to start this module by cleaning up our Web API project. In this video, we are going to do a small cleanup of our Movies API ASP.NET Core application. So, let's go to controllers, and I want to delete this weather forecast controller. I'll delete this. OK. And I will also delete this class weather forecast. Delete. OK. And let's also go to genres controller. And let's do some cleanup here. In our case, we're not really going to use the iRepository abstraction because we are going to inject directly the application DB context when we get to use Entity Framework Core. But if by some reason you want to use the iRepository, you are free to do so. But I will delete this from here, and I will delete this, and also I will delete this from here. I will leave the iLogger because that is fine. I will delete this from here, all of this, and I will just leave this HTTP GET. In here, just to have some test data, I will do a new list of genres, and I will say new genre, and then I will say ID equal to 1 and name equal to comedy. This is something that will come from a database that we will build in this same module, but for now, I want to have this just for testing. Now let's come down here. I can remove this from here, and this param2 from here. And I can remove all of this. I can just delete all of this, and I will just say throw new not implemented exception control dot using system. I can do the same here in this post. I can delete this and this and this and just say I'll copy this and paste it here. And let's go down here and let's do the same here. I will have this throw new and also here this throw new. And that's it. All of these methods, we're going to implement them in the same module, but for now we're going to leave them like this. Now let's come here and let's go to entities, let's go to genre, and as you can see we have some validations here, like this. I don't want this to be 10 characters, let's make it something like 50 characters. And let me delete all of this from here, which was just testing, and this validate from here. And also this iValidatable object from here. We're going to leave the first letter uppercase because if you remember, in our front end, we had that validation. Now let me save and let's come here and let's go to filters, and I want to delete the my action filter, so delete this. OK. I want to leave the my exception filter because this is useful. Let's go to services and I will delete all of this. I will delete the whole folder actually. OK, now let's go to validations and we can leave this as it is. Let's go to startup and we can delete this from here, and let's come down here. We can leave this my exception filter. I can delete this. I can leave this add authentication. I will delete these two lines from here, and let's come down here. I can delete this app use and this add map, and also let me delete this use response caching. And that should be it. Now let me compile the application and let's see that we have this namespace here that we deleted, so I'll delete it. Now let me compile the application one more time. Now I'll press Ctrl F5 to run our application, and we have Swagger here and we have our actions, and let me go to API/genres and we can see that we have ID equal to 1 and name comedy. So we're good to go. In this video, we are going to make an HTTP request to our Web API, and also we are going to configure cores to allow our React app communicate with our Web API. So let's get started. First, I need to go to the terminal because I want to install a new package. Let me say npm install Axios at 0.21.1. Enter. With Axios, we're going to have a a small library that will help us make HTTP requests to our web API. Now, we have done that. Now let's go to make a test. I will go to Control P, index, and I'm looking for index genres, and in here I will try to communicate with our web API using Axios. So what I want to do here is that when I enter to this component, when this component is loaded, I want to issue an HTTP request to our web API. Now we know from the past that if I want to execute a function once the component is loaded, I have to use useEffect. So let's do that. Let me say useEffect control dot to import useEffect from React, and I will say here this, and I will put here an empty array so that this only executes once. Now let me say Axios control dot to import Axios dot get, because I want to do an HTTP get request, and I need to put here the URL of my web API. Now for that, I can come here to my Movies API project, and I want to press Ctrl F5 to run our application, and from here I can get the domain of my application, and also I can come here to API genres, try it out, execute, and I can copy this URL, and we can come back to Visual Studio Code and paste this here. We're not going to have this forever here. We're going to use environment variables in just a minute, but first let's make a test. Let me say now then response of type Axios response control dot to import Axios response, and I can choose here the data type that I expect the body of the HTTP response to be. In our case, it will be an array of genre DTO, so I will say genre DTO control dot array, and then I'm going to say here an anonymous function, and I'll just say console log response data, and that's it. Now let me save, and let's come to Google Chrome, and here we have our application. I will press F12 and I will go to genres. As you can see, we have an error here. Why is that? Well, the error says that we have been blocked by course policy. What does that mean? Well, it means that by default, our web API is blocking our React application because we haven't configured the fact that we want to accept HTTP requests from this origin that we have here. When I talk about origin, I mean the scheme like HTTP, HTTPS, plus the domain, plus the port, and so on. So I need to configure this on my web API. So let's do that. Let me copy this, and let's go to Movies API to Visual Studio, and in the Solution Explorer, I can go to the app-settings.development.json, and in here, I will put a new field called front-end URL, and in here I will put my URL, but please make sure to delete this last slash that we have here, because otherwise this won't work. Now let me save, and let's go to, and let me copy this, and let's go to the startup class, because that is where we have to configure our course policy. So let's come down here, and here this will be fine. We are here in the configure services method. Now let me say services at course options, and now let's come down here, semicolon here, and I will say var front end URL equal to configuration get value a string, and I will pass the front end URL field. So in this way I am getting the front end URL from this configuration provider, so that in production I only have to change this, for example by putting it on the app settings JSON file or on an environment variable or something like that. That way we don't have to be modifying our source code just to change a URL. So let me say here options at default policy builder, and here I will say builder with origins. Remember that word origins. Yeah, here we're saying what web pages will be able to use our web API. And by the way, I almost forgot to mention that the course policy is only for applications that run on a web browser. You don't have to configure course if your client application is going to be an Android application or an iOS application or a desktop application and so on. This is only for applications that will run in a browser, like our React application. So let me say here, front-end URL, then allow any method, allow any header, and then semicolon here. And now we have to put semicolon here, of course. And also we need to come down here, and after use routing, I need to say app use course. And that's it. Now let me press Ctrl F5 to run our application. And it is running. Now let's go back here, refresh. And now we have that we don't have any errors here, but we have an array, and in here we have ID1 and name comedy. Why is that? Because if you remember, in our genres controller, let's go to genres controller, we have hard-coded here that we're returning this genre that we have here with name comedy. So this is working. We are actually being able to communicate from our React application to our web API using HTTP. Now, I was mentioning you that it is not a good practice to have this hard-coded here. We should use environment variables here in React just like we just did in our web API in ASP.NET Core. So let's do that. Let me come here, and in here let me collapse SRC, and here I can right-click and create a new file. So new file .env.development. This is an environment variables file for the development environment. Now let me create an environment variable on it. I will call it React App API URL. Your environment variables here have to start with React App, so make sure to do that. Then equal to, and now I will go here and I will take the base URL of this and I will paste that here, and now we have this as an environment variable. Now I will create another file, this one for production. So let me say new file .env.production, enter, and I will repeat this in here in production, but here I will just put productions URL. Obviously this is not a real URL. I will change this when we get to deploy our web API to Azure. So let me save, and now we have these two environment variable files. Now I want to use this environment variable in our application. For that, what we're going to do is that we're going to go to SRC, and I want to create a new file because I want to centralize all of the URLs of my application in a single file. So let me say new file. I will call it endpoints.ts, enter, and in here I will say const base URL equal to process env and React API URL. This is the way you can access environment variables in your React application. So now I'm going to say export const URL genres equal to backtick base URL / genres. And that's it. Now I can use these URL genres that we're exporting here in our index genres component. So let me delete this and put this here, and then let me say import URL genres from endpoints, semicolon here. And now let me save. And now let's go to Google Chrome. Let me refresh, and let's see that if I press F12, we're going to see that we still have our comedy genre here. But now we are doing the good practice, we're following the good practice of having our URLs in an environment variable, so that when we get to publish to production, we don't really have to change the source code of our application. In this video, we are going to configure Entity Framework Core in our application. With Entity Framework Core, we are going to be able to create and interact with a real database. In our case, we are going to use a SQL Server database, although you can use Entity Framework Core with other database technologies like Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, and so on. So let's go to the Solution Explorer, let's right click on our project, and let's click on Manage NuGet Packages, and let's go to Browse, and let's click on here, and let's say Microsoft Entity Framework Core.SQL Server, and I will click on Install, I'll click on Accept, and this has been installed. As you can see, we have Entity Framework Core for SQL Server here, But if I wanted to use SQL Server for another technology, like SQLite for example, I can certainly do that. Let me delete this because now I want to install another package, which is Microsoft Entity Framework Core.tools. This one should be installed only if we are working with Visual Studio. If you are working with the .NET CLI, then you don't need this package. But in my case, I will need it. So I will click on install and I'll click on accept. If you are using Visual Studio Code and the .NET CLI, remember to have installed in your machine the Entity Framework Core CLI. So we have this, so we can close this, and now we can come to the Solution Explorer. I need to create a new class, add class, which is going to be called Application DB Context. In Entity Framework Core, the DB Context is a class that contains the central configuration of Entity Framework for your application. For example, here we are going to have things like what tables we are going to have in our database, certain configurations for those tables, and so on. And now we have to inherit from DB Context control dot to bring the namespace Microsoft Entity Framework Core, control dot again, and now generate constructor application with options. I can control dot here and bring this. Now, as I told you before, here we can configure what tables we are going to have in our database. In Entity Framework Core, we are going to use our entities to model the tables of our database. As you know, we have the genre entity, so we can use it. Let's say property here, db set of genre, control dot here, and I will bring the namespace Movies API entities, and let me close this, and in here I can put genres. These genres here represent the name of the table in our database. Now, something else that we need is a connection string. For that, we're going to use our app settings. So let's go to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to appsettings.development.json, and below here, we're going to say connection strings, colon here, and we're going to call it default connection, colon here. And to be consistent, I want to capitalize this. Now I will say data source, which is the location of my server. In my case, I can put a dot here, or you can put whatever location your database server is. Then we have initial catalog for the database name. In my case, I will say Movies API, semicolon, and I can say integrated security equal to true, which means that I want to use my Windows authentication credentials to log in my database server. You can also use username and password if you have to. Now, if you don't have SQL Server installed, but you have localDB, you can do the following. You can say localDB / and MSSQL localDB. And that should be enough if you have localDB in your machine. But in my case, I want to use SQL Server, so I will just put a dot here. Now I can save this. Now finally, the configuration that we have to do is in the startup class. We have to configure the application DB context so that it is used in dependency injection. We have to serve it through the dependency injection system. So we're going to say services at DB context, and I will pass application DB context here. And as a parameter, I can say options.use SQL server control dot, and I'll bring this namespace. And to use SQL Server, I can pass the connection string. So here I will say configuration.getConnectionString, and in here we're going to put default connection, which is this connection string that we have here. So let me put a semicolon here, and that should be it. With this, we have configured Entity Framework Core in our application, and now we're ready to use it. If you are using Visual Studio, you have to go to the Package Manager console, which I have here, though if you don't have it, you can always go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager console, and if you are using Visual Studio Code, you can go to the command line. In Visual Studio, I can say add migration, and I can name it whatever I want. I like to call it initial for the first migration. If you are using the .NET CLI, you can use the command that you have on the screen, and I'll press enter, and this has succeeded, and this has created this migration. A migration is like an intermediate step in which we are going to be presented with what is going to happen with our database. For example, here it says that a table will be created. What is the name of the table? Genres. What are the columns of that table? ID and name, and so on. So if we check this and everything is okay, then we can go to the next step, and that is to apply the migration. So let's go back to the Package Manager console, and let's use the following command: update database. Now before I press enter, I want to go to SQL Server Management Studio, because I want you to see that in here, in my database server, I don't have a database called Movies API. And because of that, Entity Framework Core, when I run this command and I'll press enter, Entity Framework Core will see that, and then it will create the database for me. If the database were already created, then it will simply use that database and apply these changes that I have here. So let's go to SQL Server Management Studio, let me refresh, and as you can see we have Movies API, and we have in tables, we have genres, which has the columns, ID and name, and we also have this EF migration history, which, and let me make a select of 1000, which have the information of the migrations that has been applied. Here, as you can see, we have that the initial migration has been applied in this database. In this video, we are going to write the code for retrieving genres from the database and also for inserting genres in the database. So we are here in Visual Studio in our Movies API project in the genres controller class, and in here first I need to get a hold of the application DB context so that we can retrieve the genres from the database. So let me say here, comma, here in the constructor, I want to say application DB context control dot, create an assigned field, and now I have the context as a field of the class, which means that I can use it from every single method of this class. Now I will come here to this get method that we have here, and I want to delete this hard-coded genre that we have here because we don't need that anymore, and instead what I want to do is to say return await context genres. When I say context.genres, it means that I want to work with the genres table. So I want to say to list async. To list async means that I want to get the records of my table genres as a list. So this is going to return a list of genres, which means that I can say then list of genres as the return value of this method that I have here, which is excellent. Now we are done here. Look how simple this code is for us to retrieve records of a table of a database. Now let me go to post, because it is here where we are going to write the code for inserting a record in the database. I can say here then context genres add, and then we can write genre here. Now this is not adding still the genre in the table of genres. No, this is only marking this object as to be added. In order for the operation to be fulfilled, I need to say save changes. So I need to come here and say await context save changes async, and now that I did this is when our changes will be persisted into the database. Now as you can see, we have an error here because I am using the await operator, which means that I have to be in a async function. And let me say here task of action result, because we know that from a asynchronous method we need to return task of something. So after that, let me just say return no content, because I don't want to return anything from here. And when I say nothing, this is actually a 204 in the HTTP standard. So we are indeed returning something, but that something is an OK result to our clients, but it's not sending anything in the body of the HTTP request. That is what I mean when I say that we're not returning anything. Now, something else that we can do is that we can actually omit the genres from here. Let's see that. I can delete genres from here and this will still work. Why is that? Because Entity Framework Core is smart enough to know that if we are adding a genre, and notice that this is a genre, since I am adding a genre, Entity Framework Core knows that that belongs to the genres table. So we can say just context.add and that will be enough. Now that we have finished this, we can go to our front end to work with creating genres. In this video, we are going to work with creating a genre. So what we're going to do is that we're going to come here to create genre, and in here we see that we have our form. Now, there are two things that we need to do. The first one is to include a new validation in our React form because we need to limit the size of the name of the genre to 50 characters, and also we need to use Axios to issue an HTTP request to our web API when we click on Save Changes. So let's do that. Let me go to Visual Studio Code and I want to go to my genre form. So let me go to here, genre form, and let me minimize this. And in here, after that require, I can say max, and with max, I can define the max length of the name of the genre. So let me say 50 for 50 characters, and then the error message, which will be max length is 50 characters. Okay, that is done. Now I can go to the create genre component so that we can use Axios to execute an HTTP post to our web API. So let me come here and let me say async function create, and I will receive a genre of type genre creation DTO, and that comes from, we can import that from the genres model file, and in here I will use try, await, Axios control dot to import Axios, post, and I need the genres URL that comes from this endpoints file that we have here. So let me paste that here and let me import that, and also let me pass the genre. Now I need to take into account that an error could occur, so let me say here console error, and then that's it. Now I only need to use this history React hook that we have here so that we can help the user navigate away from this page. So let me say history push / genres. And that's it. Now we need to invoke this function from here, from the onSubmit. So I can delete all of this because we don't need it anymore. And I can say here, await, create, value. And we can say semicolon here. And that's it. Now we are good to go. Let's go back to Google Chrome. I will refresh just in case. And I will press F12. And I want you to see something. I will say drama, for example, save changes. And in here, we are redirected back to the index genres component, and I can expand here, and as you can see, we have ID1 named drama, and this comes from the database. Let's see that. Let me say create genre one more time. Let's say comedy, press enter, and now here we have two genres, drama and comedy. Let me create a few more genres before we go to the database to confirm that all of this is coming from the database. Let me say here action, enter, create genre, fantasy, enter, create genre, animation, enter, create genre, sci-fi, enter, create genre, and adventure, enter. Okay, so we have 7 genres as you can see here. Now let's go to our database. We can go to Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. we have here Movies API, and we can right click on genres, select top 1000 rows, and in here, as you can see, we have our 7 genres from drama to adventure. So indeed, we are creating these records in the database. Now, there is something that we must address. Let me close this and let's go to create genre. And let's say something. Let's say that I write drama here with a lowercase d. Now, we will get this validation right away from React, and that is fine. But what would happen if this validation didn't occur here? For example, let me go to Visual Studio Code and let me go to genre form, and let's say that for some reason I forgot to add this first letter uppercase validation here. And remember that in the genre class in Visual Studio we have that validation in place. So let's see what happens. Let me go back here and let me refresh, and I will say drama, and we're going to see that we don't have any errors. And if I press save changes, we're going to see that nothing happens. And if we press F12, we're going to see that we have a 400 error here. The 400 errors means that our request was bad. 400 means bad request. And the problem is that in the server we are doing this validation and it is failing, and therefore we're getting back a 400. But our user is not seeing that. Our React application is not displaying the error to the user. So let's see how we can read the validation errors returned by the Web API and display them here in React. In this video, we are going to try to make our lives easier so that when we return validation errors from our Web API, instead of returning an object, I want to return a simple array that will be easy to handle from our front end. So let's do that. Let me go to the Solution Explorer, and I want to go to filters, and in here I will create a filter. Let me say class here. I'll call it parse bad request, enter, and in here what we're going to do is that we're going to create an action filter. So I will say I action filter control dot to import this, control dot to implement the interface, and let me delete executing. And what I want to do is to intercept a 400 bad request and change the representation of the errors that is going to be sent to our client application. And I will say var result equal to context result as iStatus code action result. I will try to cast this to iStatus code action result, and if result is equal to null, then I will just return there is nothing we can do in that case. Otherwise, I will say status code equal to result.status code. Now, if status code is equal to 400, then we're going to do some logic. We are going to say here var response equal to new list of a string, and let me put this as lowercase s. Then I will say var bad request object result equal to context result as bad request object result, and if this bad request object result is a string, so is a string, then we're just going to say response at, and we're going to say bad request object result value to a string. This happens sometimes that we return a bad request that will contain a single error as a string. So in that case, we will just return an array of one element. And this, by the way, is going to be our response array, or response list in this case. So let me say here, else. If we don't have a string here, then it means we have an object. So we have to iterate it. So let me say, for each key in context model state keys, I want to iterate all of the keys defining the model state, so that I can say for each error in context model state key errors. And in this way, I will be able to access all of the errors defined in the different properties of the object. So let me say here response at, and I will use the following formatting. I will say, and let me put this here. Now let me say key, colon, error, error message, semicolon here. And now after all of that, I will say context result equal to new bad request of the result, and we're going to pass the response. And that's it from here. Now I want to register this filter as a global filter. So let's go to the startup class and let's go here to the configure services method. I'm looking for these add controllers. I will say options, filters, add, type of, and I will pass the parse bad request filter. Now that is on the one hand. On the other hand, if you remember, in our controllers we have a API controller attribute, and that attribute has some rules that we need to override when it comes to returning an error. So let's do that. Let me come here and I will create a new folder. Let me collapse all of that. Right click on Movies API, add new folder, API behavior, enter. Right click here, add class bad request behavior, enter. And in here I will create a unique method which is going to be a static void parse, and we're going to receive API behavior options as a parameter, options, and in here I will do the following. I will say options invalid model state response factory action context lambda function, and in here I will basically do the exact same algorithm that I had here. I will do this. I will even copy it from here and just paste it here. Just that. Let me change this to context just so we don't have to rename those variables. And let me define a response variable here, response new list string, and that's done. Now let me say here return new bad request of the result response and a semicolon here. And that's it. Now I have to apply this behavior to our web API. For that I have to go back to the startup class, and in here I can say in these add controllers, after the add controller I will say configure API behavior options, and I will pass bad request behavior dot parse semicolon here. And that's it. Now we can make a small test. Let me go to the Solution Explorer. I want to go to Entities Genre, and in here we have this string length and first letter uppercase validation. I will change this to 10 just temporarily so that it is easy for us to make a test. Let me press Ctrl F5 to run our application, and here we have our application. But I want to go to Postman, so let me copy this. And let me go to Postman, let me open a tab, I will paste this here, and I will say API genres, and I will make a post, and I will say body, raw, text, JSON, and I will create an object here, I will say name, and here I will say drama, and I will write something else. So this is definitely more than 10 characters, therefore we are breaking 2 of our validation rules. So let me say send, and as we can see we only have one error. That is because we made a mistake here. We changed genre. This should be 50. What we wanted to change was genre creation DTO, so let me say genre creation DTO, and in here I need to say 10 just temporarily. Now let me press Ctrl F5 one more time. We have our API running. And let's come back here, send, and now we have 2 errors. But not only that, those errors are in an array. So now it will be easy for us in the front end to just iterate this array and display each of those elements. So now that that is done, let me go back here before I forget and put this back as 50. So that we don't have any issues with our application.